think we are live. Okay, everyone, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Eugene Rogers. I'm here with Dr. Kumea Shorter-Gooden, and we're so excited to have a conversation today about diversity specifically and broadly. Before we begin, though, I have to extend a quick shout of thanks. First of all, to ACDA for having the social media take over for the Diversity Initiatives Committee. We're able to do this because Chorus America has allowed Dr. Shorter-Gooden to be in their office, and Hal Leonard has allowed me to be in their office today to be able to work together. So it takes a whole village to make this work. And so a special shout out to ACDA, Chorus America, and Hal Leonard. Just a bit before we get started, everyone, to talk about just a little bit the Diversity Initiatives Committee of ACDA. We began about 2.5 years ago. It's one of 7 standing committees that Tim Sharp, our executive director, felt strongly that we needed to move our organization forward, and the Diversity Initiatives was one of those committees. I am one of 5 members of that committee, and the first thing we wanted to do was get a mission statement. And so briefly, I want to just read our mission statement because hopefully all of the things that you see and hear today are a reflection of that. The mission of the Diversity Initiatives Committee is to foster diversity and inclusivity in our membership and our ensembles and our repertoire through active engagement with underrepresented choral musicians and potential choral participants. As a result of this inclusivity, the committee plans to bring about a broader definition of choral excellence to maintain relevance through the expansion of both the reach and impact of our profession and its musical scope. Today, we actually will have a broad conversation about diversity and sort of, for some of us, really, what does diversity mean? What does equality versus equity mean? Some of these questions I'm going to ask Dr. Shorter-Gooden to speak on, but I want to briefly read her bio because you should know who this wonderful human being is that we're going to be speaking with today. From 2012 to 2016, Kumea served as the first Chief Diversity Officer and Associate Vice President at the University of Maryland, College Park. Formerly, she served as Associate Provost for International Multicultural Initiatives at Alliant International University, as professor at the California School of Professional Psychology. She is a licensed psychologist and the co-author of Shifting, The Double Lives of Black Women in America, a winner of the 2004 American Book Awards. She's currently the principal at Shorter-Gooden Consulting based in Washington, D.C., and she's consulted with many different organizations such as the American Psychological Association, the Arabella Advisors, the National Hispanic Health Foundation, and our very own Chorus America, and now American Choral Directors Association. She's a native of Washington, D.C. She earned her bachelor's degree magna cum laude from Princeton University and her PhD in clinical community psychology from the University of Maryland. Welcome, Dr. Shorter-Gooden.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. What a warm, warm welcome. And I am delighted to be here. I'm very excited about the work that ACDA is engaged in to bring greater equity, diversity, and inclusion to the choral field. So it's wonderful that you all are shining a bright spotlight on these issues through today's sessions and events.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to start off with some really broad questions. First of all, could you just talk to us briefly about why are equity, diversity, and inclusion important, and what's the value of these areas?
Sure. Well, we know that music can inspire, can soothe, can deepen people's understanding of life, can bring people together. And the question arises, don't we want everyone, regardless of background, to have that opportunity? Regardless of race or gender or socioeconomic status or sexual orientation or ability or religion, wouldn't we want everyone to have the opportunities that we know music and choral engagement and expression can bring? So that's one huge reason. It's important to level the playing field so all have access and opportunity. It's also important because demographics are changing, right? I mean, the demographics of the U.S., particularly in terms of race, ethnicity, nationality, nationality of origin, are rapidly changing. We will soon be a nation that's majority minority. And for choral groups or other groups to thrive in the mid 21st century, it really means engaging diverse folks who may not have been there back when, or may not have been there in great numbers back when this work began, but who more and more are on the scene. And so there's this sort of demographic or business case that the institutions and organizations that will thrive in mid 21st century are those that look out beyond the usual suspects and find ways to engage a more diverse crowd. And the third reason, which I think echoes part of your mission statement, which I love that mission around diversity at ACDA, that is for inclusive excellence. More and more we know that diverse teams, heterogeneous teams, are more able to do innovative, creative work, bring diverse standpoints and ways of seeing the world that really allow our work, our creations to be better. Now, a little caveat, diverse teams can be more complicated. It can take a little more work. There can be some hitches. We don't always get each other. It can be slow. We can give up. But there's evidence that if we hang in there, that these diverse groups can do better. And so there's also the excellence rationale. Do we want our choral music, our choral groups, our choruses to find ways to be even more excellent? And diversity is another lever for that.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. Hearing you talk about it's not always easy. I think that's where the real work happens, sometimes when it's not easy. But once we can work through that, you're right. I mean, the magic is something that is hard to even explain when it really works.
Yes.
Can you talk to us about the difference between equity and equality?
Yes. So equality means treating everyone the same. And equality is a good word, right? It's a word that's been part of the U.S., the nation's ethos for a long time. It's a good word. But it means treating everyone the same. I'm giving out shoes. I'm going to give everyone a size 8. That's equality, but that's not equity, because some people aren't going to be able to wear those shoes comfortably. Right?
I just said ouch when you said that.
Yeah, gotcha. Equity is taking into account the fact that some people have been disadvantaged and trying to achieve equal outcomes. So it's a focus on the impact. It's not saying, well, gee, we haven't had to do much outreach to get white members of our choir, so why are y'all talking about outreach into Latinx and Black people? That would be equality. We don't do it for them. But equity says we want equal outcomes. If we're not getting Latinx and Black people into our choirs using the same old techniques that we've used with others, then we need to do something different. We need to mix it up in order to achieve equitable outcomes.
Absolutely. And for us, that can mean so many factors: repertoire. It can obviously mean even the approach, access. How are we going into those in the different communities, if you will, that speak specifically to those to anyone from a different background than the majority, of course.
Absolutely.
I love for you to talk about also the difference between diversity and inclusion. Those words, sometimes one can use them as if they're synonyms, but I'd love for you to talk about the difference between those two.
Yeah, and the terms are tossed around so much that sometimes it feels like they can begin to lose meaning. So it's important to look at that. Diversity in its clearest form is compositional diversity. It's who's at the table. It's looking around and counting whether we have people from different racial, ethnic, sexual orientation, gender, ability, religion, etc. backgrounds. And that's really, really important, right? To make sure that those in the chorus, those in the space, come from diverse backgrounds and presumably are representative of the communities that we engage and serve. Inclusion has to do with what happens once they get into the choral space. What happens once they join the group? What happens once they're in ACDA? Are people from diverse backgrounds, from different cultural identities, social identities, experiencing a sense of welcome, feeling fully included, feeling like their unique talents and gifts are being brought to the fore? So it's the difference between being brought to the table, brought into the space, and being pulled in and acknowledged and affirmed for who you are. And as you can hear, while compositional diversity is an issue for us, and I know it's an issue in choral music, inclusion is in some ways more complicated, and it's not just about looking around and counting heads. It's about understanding on a deeper level how people are experiencing the space. Do they have to check their identities at the choral door? Do I get to come, but I can't really bring fully me to this space? Do I have to leave part of me at home or in my neighborhood? If that's the case, that's not inclusion.
Because that requires us, you think about welcoming unique talents, it definitely requires us sometimes to look at the canon. It requires us to look at how we maybe audition and how we, obviously it definitely requires us to welcome, the energy in the room may feel a lot different when we have someone who's used to bringing their unique talents that don't fit into maybe our own experience or knowledge. You know, it requires us sometimes, I think, to be the student, even with our students, from a different way, in order to welcome unique gifts that are not our own. So that's powerful. That's the harder work.
That's the really hard work, right? Because I think, you know, the sort of 60s view of diversity was, and I'm going to parody it, is we'll let those unfortunate folks in so that they can avail themselves of the great things that we have to offer. Right? That's sort of
powerful.
But that's not inclusion. Inclusion is teach me, bring your own identity, culture, background, ways of seeing the world so that we can learn together. So that means we're shaking things up. We're not doing the same old thing, but with a few brown or black or gay or different faces. We're actually beginning to do something different in terms of the core of the work, the repertoire, what we sing, how we do that, the cultural surround and context that we bring to the work begins to look different. So it really is quite radical in a sense. It's not just adding in people. It's really rethinking how we do what we do, which again will make all of us more excellent in this work.
And also requires a certain amount of, I like to describe it as radical empathy, because in order for me to lean into that discomfort, as I know you talk about this, leaning into that discomfort, it requires that a certain level of empathy in order for me to embrace this person who, and whatever they're bringing, that may feel, make me feel awfully uncomfortable, and to get to know them in that way.
Yeah. It's hard work, isn't it? I mean, human beings, as I understand it, you know, evolved living in small bands of 20 to 40 to 60 people who looked a lot like us. And I think we're still, even though we're, many thousands of years beyond that, we tend to be much more comfortable and at ease in a kind of automatic way. And part of that is because it helps to simplify the world, to be able to say, okay, someone who looks like me, I got them. They mean me no harm. And so there's some reasons why we tend to gravitate towards people who are like us and feel very comfortable. If someone understands me culturally, I can kind of relax a bit and just be. In engaging with someone who's different, I may have to, as you say, lean in, work to understand their perspective, look at some of my assumptions about how the world is or how life must be, and interrogate those and unpack them. takes some extra work. But in this global world where we're no longer in small groups of 20, 40, 60, that's the requirement, isn't it?
And thank goodness, I'm glad we're not just in 20, 40, 60. Let's move on. What would you say are key components or elements of programs or organizations that are equitable, diverse, and inclusive? And a second part of that would be, what do these programs look and feel like?
Sure. So I'd say there's several key elements that connect to choral organizations and beyond. Access is important, right? And that gets at compositional diversity.
Yes.
Do people from diverse backgrounds have access? Do people who are in wheelchairs have access to our choral institutions? That can be a physical thing. Do people feel like they can get in? People from diverse groups, people from low SES, low socioeconomic circumstances, people who are Latinx and Black and Asian and Native. So access is important. In addition, success is important. So we can't just stop with, okay, they got in the door, they got in the chorus. We've got to look at, how do they fare? Is there attrition? Do we have higher attrition amongst those from historically or contemporaneously marginalized groups? Or are we retaining such folk? And do they have equal opportunity to become leaders? So access to leadership is also important. Yes. So access and success are important. The core work, and you spoke to this earlier, the repertoire. What do we do? We're singing, we're performing, we're composing music, we are arranging. What's the music that we're engaged with? Diverse, equitable, inclusive organizations look at the core work and say, how does it need to shift and change? How do we need to rethink this? How do we need to create space for different voices, literally and metaphorically, so that we are more representative? So the core work is important. And then climate is another key element. And you can see these elements, access, success, the core work, and climate intersect. If the climate is not healthy and positive, if people do feel like they have to check their identities at the door, they're less likely to be retained, or they're less likely to walk in the door in the first place. So we want to know whether people feel engaged, welcomed, feel like their talents are being really utilized, how they are experiencing the chorus, the organization that they're in. So I would say those are the core elements. And maybe implicit in this is that there needs to be leadership around equity, diversity, and inclusion. I think all of us can play a role. Yes. Any choral member has a role. But the director, the leadership of the chorus, of the choral organization, can help really set the tone that this is important for all of us, because it certainly is something that everyone can play a part in impacting and making a difference.
So when you say leadership, you're not, again, I just want to get clarity for our members. I'm having trouble seeing your screen is getting a little fuzzy here. Hopefully, I don't know if that's what everyone else is seeing. I may have to log out and log back in. I don't know we'll see if it clears up on its own.
All right, sure.
But there we go. It's back again. You mentioned leadership. I just want to be clear in case there's some questions. And we do ask people, by the way, to send questions. We will have time at the end to ask Dr. Shorter-Gooden some questions. So please be sending those in the comments of Facebook if you'd like. But leadership here, you're not specifically meaning that the leadership only needs to be people from maybe these marginalized communities or underrepresented communities. Can you clarify that just a bit more?
Yeah, it's a great point. No, obviously there need to be many opportunities for people from marginalized communities to be to take on leadership roles. But I'm talking about any and all leadership ought to be leadership for equity, diversity, inclusion, whether the person is a white, straight male or a gay Latinx person. So Leadership is really key. Yeah.
Yes, the
One person
mindset.
said, a colleague who's a psychologist, Beverly Daniel Tatum, former president of Spelman, once talked about the moving walkway. And what she said was, we're all on a moving walkway in this society, which moves towards bias, stereotypes, disprivileging some, disempowering others. We didn't necessarily ask to be on this walkway, but that's what it is, right? And unless we do something proactive to step off the walkway, to run back the other way, we are complicit in, collusive with, enabling of bias, disempowerment. And so I mentioned that actually, that metaphor I think is an apt one for everyone, but particularly for leaders, it says simply doing what you've been doing and not doing something proactively that moves against those sort of standard ways that we have been socialized to operate in this society is not good enough.
Excellent. That's wonderful. What do you think gets in the way of creating these environments that we were speaking about? What really keeps us from making progress? I mean, I have many thoughts here, but I'm curious what you'd say about that.
Yeah. Well, let me start with, we all have biases and stereotypes.
Yes.
Let me say that again. We all have biases and stereotypes.
Yes.
Do I need to say it again? And I think, and in this nation, this society, we tend to be negatively biased towards people of color, towards people with minority sexual orientations or LGBT, towards people from minority religious groups, people with disabilities. So that tends to be the nature of those biases. And we may not consciously be biased. In fact, I would say most of us articulate a very positive, conscious commitment to equity, an egalitarian world, egalitarian organizations. But there's a lot of evidence, I'm a psychologist, that our unconscious often belies our conscious intent. That our biases, our negative views of people who are Black or Latinx or gay or lesbian or trans or Sikh or Muslim or low socioeconomic status, that those biases may not be at top of mind. And if you ask me, I'm like, no, I'm all good with that. And actually would love to have folks from all those groups in my course and doing this work. But my heart is in a different place. And so that disconnect between what we believe and what we feel and what really emerges. So while we articulate a desire to reach out and to engage people from all groups, we aren't doing it. We stay in our cliques. We don't reach out. We look at people who are different and think, I don't think that's a good fit.
That's a good line.
Right? Which often speaks to cultural differences, because what's a good fit is kind of someone like me, right? I like my culture, who I am, and I tend to be gravitate again toward people who do life the way I do it. Somebody's a little different, and so we have this conscious commitment, but it is undermined, if you will, by these biases that we have not taken the time to unpack and mitigate and work against.
And often, because again, as you said, all of us have biases, often we may not even be aware of how we're making these decisions from that place. I think the first whole part of this is everyone admitting, I don't care who you are, that we bring that to the table.
That's right.
And it is only through, as I like to say, turning that apple the other way, which could be a friend, which could be listening in or asking some questions or who knows, fill in the blank, that we become slowly aware of some of those questions. I remember reading a list of questions when we worked together last, and how there were questions that just allowed us to think about, have you ever grown up worrying about going outside of your home.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever have an evening where your lights were, you didn't have enough money in your family to have the lights, pay the electric bill. So you sat all night with your lights off. You know, there are many, and,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not a bad thing if you haven't, but maybe you've never even thought about it, which
Right.
causes that separation, or that, if you will, that subconscious bias that you're speaking
That's
about.
right. We have this false narrative that good people do not have biases. And I think most of us, almost all of us, see ourselves as good people. So we have to sort of separate ourselves. No, no biases. No, not me, right? We need to change that. We need to flip it. Good people have biases. We come by them honestly, if you will. We grow up, if you grow up on this planet, you grow up on a planet that's rife with biases against different groups. US, again, it's typically negative biases towards people of color, people who are LGBT, etc. And so good people are people who have biases, but who are working to become more and more aware of them, and who are struggling to mitigate them, to overcome them. That to me is a good person.
Absolutely.
And so I think we've got to surface this stuff in order to deal with it.
Yes. Again, not easy work.
Not easy, not easy work,
But
not
it's
easy.
the way.
Easier said than done, for
Yes, it
sure.
is. I know people ask this question often: how can we get to deeper issues of diversity and explore diversity that is not only color and ethnicity? You know, it's obviously today we're speaking about diversity in the broadest sense, and you've referred to all
Yes,
those things. But
yes.
often, some organizations even say, I'm only talking about diversity from this perspective, or just the conversation tends to stop there. So how can we even more conceptualize the intersections of poverty and political thought and alternative practice beyond just brown and black, if you will?
Yeah, it's a great point. And we know race is a huge issue. It's perhaps a particularly huge issue right now in our country, though of course it
Yeah.
has been a huge issue for hundreds of years. The whole founding of this nation, if you will, speaks to that. Uh, so race and racism are big, and nobody's just one thing, right? Your word intersection is really important, because we are different. Everyone has multiple identities. And so as I walk through the world, some of what I've experienced has to do with being African American, some has to do with being a woman, uh, some has to do with being a person who identifies as straight, as Christian, as relatively able bodied, as middle class at this point in my life. There are multiple identities. And it's really important to recognize that and for people who are at the intersections of several marginalized identities, we have to be particularly tuned in. What seeks like for someone who's lesbian and uh, Latina and low socioeconomic,
Yeah.
right? How does that all play out? So I think the tent needs to be a pretty big tent, and we need to understand wherever there are disparities and differences in outcomes based on identity, that we need to be looking at that, paying attention to that. And there's certainly documented differences in outcomes based on race and gender and sexual orientation, and all of that becomes important.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, because I think it almost, when you said that, I was just sitting here going through my own list, because as you say, we all have those different identities. I don't know if that's the exact wording, but it's almost as if
Mm-hmm.
everyone needs to think of themselves from every area. Where do I line up here? What do I represent? And to continue to talk about all of those. I think it's challenging because, as you said, race is particularly huge in this country. It's a huge challenge, and it
Yeah.
seems as if
Yeah.
as soon as it feels as if with race we take one step forward and two steps backwards. We're
Mm-hmm.
constantly on this journey here. But in order for us to continue to have more people at the table. I think we have to push ourselves to think about the intersectionality of all of these issues and areas of diversity beyond just, not only, I should say, race, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways that frame I think can help us is many people, not everyone, but I would say most people have some area of their identity where they are marginalized. Yeah. Maybe it's gender, maybe they're a woman, maybe it's sexual orientation, maybe it's religion, maybe it's ability, maybe it's socioeconomic status. And often that area, if one taps into one's experience related to that area, that can provide a pathway to understanding people who may be marginalized based on another identity. You remember the pain, the shame, the feelings related to growing up impoverished, and that may help you to connect with and understand the experience that someone who's Black, maybe not impoverished, may have as she walks down the street. So I think the other piece of it is the areas where we're privileged. For me, for example, I identify as straight, I identify as Christian, I identify as middle class. Those are areas that I'm likely to begin to kind of take for granted. And if I'm not careful, I'm going to collude with heterosexism or homophobia. I'm going to collude with a Christocentric kind of bias. Yes. I'm going to collude with class bias. So while I'm really down around issues of race and gender, and those are like forefront, and you ask me about race and gender, I can talk all day, I need to be pushed to think, okay, Kumea, are you coming out as an ally around issues of sexual orientation, around gender identity expression, around religion? Those are the things where you can walk through the world pretty safely and easily. And so that's it can, thinking about our multiple identities can help us connect with others and figure out areas where we may not be fully seeing our complicity with bias.
I mean, I tell you, there's so many areas that I could go into with what you just said. because I'm often, and I'll just say this, I'm often confused when I see marginalized communities discriminate against other marginalized communities. But as you said, when you look at ourselves in these multifaceted ways, and if we look at these areas that we know, I've got this, I'm in the acceptable group here, it is very easy to turn off that, as I like to say, radical empathy in those other areas. But it calls for a holistic approach, and each of us looking at our entire selves. I'll move on. Ooh, that was good.
Yes.
Is implicit bias a real thing? And if so, what impact does it have?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, implicit bias has recently become the talk of our nation, right? It came up in the vice presidential debates, I think it was in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. Starbucks, recently shut down a week or so ago because of the incident of two Black men the police being called is because they're sitting there in Starbucks, right? So I would say it's absolutely a real thing. There's a lot of social science over the last couple of decades that shows that people's biases are often not conscious. So it really speaks to what I was alluding to earlier, that what we say we believe and what comes out if you watch our actions are two different things. So there's a lot of evidence that our implicit biases, and there's an implicit association test, which anyone and everyone can take if you have access to a computer. Google implicit association test. It's a platform hosted by Harvard University. And you can go online and find out whether you have implicit biases against Blacks, against women, against people who are overweight, against people who are religious minorities. I mean, a plethora of categories.
Oh, that's powerful. We'll make sure we post that.
So it's a really great resource. There's a lot of evidence that how people and they assess it not by saying, do you have a bias against black people? It's done in a more complicated way, because what
Sure.
they know is if you ask people that question, they'll say generally no,
Right.
but they may test in a different way, and their test results are a better predictor of their behavior. So we know there's something real there. And of course, the impact can be from life-threatening, as someone has said, a police officer, a law enforcement officer with implicit bias, that can be a fatal thing, right? That can be a fatal thing. You see the black guy holding a cell phone, and it looks to you like a gun, and you shoot. You see the white guy holding a cell phone, and you realize it's a cell phone, and you don't shoot. So there are fatal consequences, but there are also all kinds of consequences along the continuum. You know, who
Yes.
we select, who we see as worthy of being in our group, who gets hired, who gets, what we think about the music, the repertoire, the canon, what's seen as worthy and important and excellent, and what's seen as fringe and exotic, interesting, but not really of the kind of quality that we expect. All of our biases impact that.
Sound. And I think for choral musicians, you know, am I, you know, do I tend to favor only one sound? You know, when I think of choral ensembles, when I think of choral excellence, how does that affect those choirs that I like, those choirs that are able to move forward, you know, or get recognition, if you will? You know, that's a very specific way in our field sometimes where bias comes out. Even that way. So the continuum is pretty broad, actually, when you think about it.
Yes, absolutely. And so we're in a new day. Some people refer to it as sort of modern isms, right? And ironically, if we talk just about race for a second, back in the day, if someone called you the N-word or said, no, we're not going to give you, we don't lend money for folks to buy houses in this neighborhood, that's explicit, overt racism. Horrible, horrifying. Glad that mostly that's over. Not entirely, mostly it's over. But it's clear, it's crisp, it's out there. Implicit bias is insidious. It's sneaky. And even the person perpetrating it doesn't know that they're perpetrating it. I really just want a quality alto for my chorus, right? Of course I'm interested in people who are diverse.
Yes.
But there's something about that African-American guy that just rubs my unconscious the wrong way, and I'm not even aware of it. I'm just not feeling, I'm not feeling it. So what's tricky and sneaky and difficult is, ironically, as we've made progress as a nation, we're now in a territory where it's a bit harder sometimes to tease out what's really going on. Because for the most part, I don't think people are saying you can't join our chorus because you're black, or we don't take people who are lesbian, right?
Yes.
And that's not what people are feeling. But their stuff, our stuff, comes out and has an impact. So it's real, it's hard because it isn't fully conscious, but there are ways to kind of work to bring our biases to the fore. And I think that's often best done in community, where we all acknowledge that we're all in this together.
Yes,
None of us are immune to this.
I like that word community, which is, as you know, is absolutely what we are as choral ensemble. At least that's what we hope to be. I have a few questions coming in. First question is, my mantra has been to program with rather than for. Is this a healthy way to think for success? I'll say that this, again, my mantra has been to program with rather than for. Is this a healthy way to think of success?
I like that. I mean, absolutely. Programming with is collaborative, it's collegial, It's engaging with diverse groups as equals and peers rather than a kind of patronizing, possibly paternalistic, we're going to do this for this, which we know the kind of colonial mentality, which
Yes.
is can be well intended, but can be deeply problematic as it perpetuates a kind of two-tier, we're really superior, we're helping you unfortunate people. So absolutely, I think programming with is the way to go. Reaching out, engaging with the community, finding out what kinds of choral work and experiences make sense for them, bringing them in, having them participate
Yes.
in decision making, not just being
Yes.
recipients of.
Decision
Absolutely.
making and the education,
Yes.
for me,
Yes.
that with is also with experts. The wonderful, what I like to tell people is we are in the best time possible to get to educate ourselves about difference, because technology, as you can see, makes
Yes.
things so much easier to Skype these folks to anyone in that maybe is an expert in the area, or have a conversation with someone. It really can take away this idea that, well, I live in this community where I don't have anyone that has that background. We just don't have, to me, we don't have those excuses anymore with all of
That's
the
right.
resources and experts there are. Let's go on to a few more questions. This is a question that I probably will answer. What is considered an acceptable sound? And that's a good question. An acceptable sound, I think for me personally, varies depending on the style and genre of that music. Obviously, we want students or singers to have to be able to sing longer than one day or 1 year in our ensembles. But we know that there are gospel singers who've been singing since the age of 5 to 70 and 80, and there are opera singers who started out and found that they have some trouble within 10 years. So it's not the style of music. It's really just understanding that individual's vocal capabilities and working with them to find their health within that style. But that acceptable sound, to me, is one that is as true and as authentic to that sound of that genre and style as this person or ensemble can make. That's how I would define that. It requires us to be it requires us as conductors to have as much knowledge about the voice, to be as open as possible to the way different groups of people make sounds and what's happening physically. It just requires us, I think, in order to have our ensembles be as diverse as possible, it requires us to do a lot more homework. Our teaching, sometimes we are all taught in a very specific way. Our teachers can only give us what they know. But that doesn't mean that's the only way of making those sounds and exploring new territory. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how I think about that. This question is, what can professional choral organizations do to foster equity, diversity, and inclusion in choral music? And just from your perspective, what would you say an organization like ACDA that's training professionals and supporting obviously singers of all ages, what are some things that you might say we can continue to do to foster this work?
So just a few things that come to me. One is of course, to look at outreach and the pipeline, to really look at what is happening now and what's been happening historically to bring diverse musical talent, musicians, voices into the choral field. And is that strategy working, or how do we diversify that strategy so that we bring in voices and faces that are different? So there's a whole pipeline. I mean, a certain outreach pipeline, getting beyond the usual suspects. A lot of organizations, even beyond the choral field, have the challenge of kind of recruiting informally through networks and the people who are already there, right?
Hmm. Yes.
Friends, my networks, my community, my neighborhood, my church, right? And that's not
Hmm.
bad, but that can lead to a very cliquish, almost incestuous kind of situation where we're really not reaching out. Even though there's that neighborhood, 2 miles down the road, uh, we got to do some outreach. So I think outreach
Hmm.
and pipeline are really important. I
Hmm.
think another thing is to look at, one thing is to track metrics. What
Yes.
what are
What
our
are the
numbers?
numbers?
Let's look
That
at
is
composition
here,
numbers.
here. Yes. I
Yeah,
love that.
what are the numbers and
Yeah.
the retention numbers? Not, sometimes people look at how many people of color or people racial underrepresented groups are in a setting, and they look at that every year, but they don't look at how much of that is a revolving door. Well, there were
Yes.
5 and 4 left, and then we got 4 more, and so it's still 5 and 3 left. So you got to look at retention too, right?
Yes.
Because
Absolutely.
that's an equity issue.
Hmm.
And leadership are people from marginalized groups. So I think tracking metrics is important. And I think asking the question, and sometimes doing simple surveys or focus groups can do this. How are people experiencing this environment? Let's talk to people from marginalized or minoritized groups and ask them, how's this working for you? What do you think we need to do differently?
Yes.
This
Absolutely.
association, this core group was founded perhaps for white middle class folk. I mean, it probably didn't
Hmm.
say that, but that was the
Sure.
reality. And now
Sure.
we've got folks who are not from that background. We want to know if this is working. What do we need to change? What can you bring? What can we learn from you? So I think asking that question, those sets of questions, is really key.
Hmm. And that I find that going back to number two of tracking the numbers, the metrics, I think sometimes that can be overlooked. But when you have an organization like ours that has upwards between 18,000 and 20,000 people who engage with this organization on one level or another, it's pretty hard sometimes to do that. But that's the only way that we really will fully understand, what, as you said, what are the actual numbers, and then from there, what is the retention?
Yeah,
And because diversity looks different, maybe in this part of the country than this part of the country, and so even getting an understanding of that, I really resonate with that, because often we're talking about things that we don't even know what are the real issues. You know.
that's right. And I guess one thing is for each group to look at what their mission or to rethink the mission. I would guess my sense is that many courses have a goal of engaging people in their community. I had the opportunity at the last Christmas holiday season to go to the Kennedy Center here in Washington 2 nights in a row. I live in DC. DC is a majority minority city.
Yep.
I wasn't shocked when I looked at the composition. These were choral events 2 nights in a row at the Kennedy Center. I must say, I wasn't shocked that there were relatively few identifiable people of color, but it was a shame in a city that's majority minority, 49% black actually, that the disparities are so great. So if part of
Mhm.
and these were local choruses.
Sure.
So I would hope that part of the mission, I would think that oftentimes the mission is to serve and represent and engage one's local community. And as you point out, the demographics are going to vary depending on where you are, but it's almost
Yes.
always more diverse than it was a decade ago,
60 years ago, or even a decade, exactly.
even a decade
Couple,
ago. Yeah.
yes, you're right. You're exactly right. A couple more questions here. This one was, does the classic tux and gowns, in your opinion, look of a choir alienate our trans students?
That is a really interesting question. I've never thought about that.
Hmm.
So I think that's a wonderful observation.
Yes.
I mean,
Well,
if the notion is that the guys wear tuxes and the women wear gowns, we've got to move beyond that, right?
absolutely.
Because now I'm hoping that in those situations, anyone can choose to wear tux or anyone can choose to wear a gown, and that's okay. I guess that's one way
Yes.
to resolve it. You know, you
Sure.
don't tell me what to wear based on your perception of my gender. I decide what I want to wear based on how I want to express myself that day. But I
I think
think
that
that
probably varies.
bifurcation into tux and
Yes.
gown sort of speaks to a very binary view of gender, which is
Yes.
not where we're at today in our
Yes.
understanding of
Standing.
gender. So the
Hmm.
tux gowns thing, it harkens back to you're either this or you're that,
Either
and
that.
there ain't no
Yes.
in between. So that I do think that's problematic.
I know that this is going to be talked about quite a bit this evening, so this is a good chance to plug our 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time guests, Mari Valverde and Jocelyn Fear, both who are trans singers who will be here talking about the Trans Voice Festival, as well as I will get a lot of questions about that. So I think I have some more thoughts, but I think your answer is sufficient enough to let them pick up on that more
Yeah,
tonight. So they
it
will
should be
definitely. So
it's a
that's
very
that's
important
a plug.
conversation.
Very important conversation. I hope people will tune in. I've got one more question here. Maybe it's time for affinity spaces groups within ACDA, at least at national conferences, perhaps. What might that look like? Just throwing it out there, no immediate answer needed. Time for affinity spaces and groups, which is,
Yeah,
it's, go ahead. I have some thoughts, but
I'm sure
I
you
don't
do.
know.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is, yeah. I mean, I'm in various professional associations related to psychology, and affinity spaces often make tremendous sense. They provide a place where people who are in the minority can can sort of feel a connection that they may not be able to feel in the broader group. That can then help that group to then go back out and be a part of the broader community in a way where they feel more engaged. Sometimes people think of it as an either or. We don't want people segregating themselves. But there's evidence that it really is both and, that when people are in the minority, they benefit from some space where they can engage with similar others, share concerns, needs, provide
Yes,
support. And that often gives them the wherewithal to engage in the broader space. And so I
absolutely.
think it's generally a great idea.
Well, and I see it from another perspective, because I was actually, it's interesting, at our last leadership meeting, Tim Sharp and I, is actually, this was the very thing I was saying to him at the end, is like, I wonder, is it time for us to have tracks, which is in a sense the affinity group, but I see it as also the idea of those not just who feel an affinity towards a group, or if you will, but those who want to learn more about a particular area, that
Yes,
we have these sessions, that if you know that you have, you got it good, as you said, I'm okay in these areas, but you want to become more aware, or more open-minded about this area, that maybe you follow that track simply for educational knowledge and perspective, which I think is great
absolutely.
as well. Um,
Absolutely.
so, well, Dr. Shorter-Gooden, I'd like to say that. It's such a pleasure. I have wanted to have a dialogue with you and have you engage with ACDA really for now 6 to 8 months it's been,
Mhm.
and it's nice to have this come to fruition. Do you have any parting words for us at all before our time comes to an end?
It's been delightful to be part of this. I'm very excited about what ACDA is doing, about the diversity initiatives and the goals that you've set. And today, I would encourage everyone who's listening to think about what their own role is, right? Whether you are a choral director or leader or not, what can you do in your space to create a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive organization? It's in working all together on this and recognizing that we're going to stumble and make mistakes along the way. Let me put that in, because that's part of it.
Yes,
Uh,
it is.
that's part of the learning and growing. But I really applaud ACDA for this initiative, and I applaud you, Dr. Rogers, for your tremendous leadership in this area.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Friends for life, and I know this won't be the last time that we
Not at
will
all.
engage with you. And thank you again to Chorus America for providing this space for you, and Hal Leonard for providing this space for me here, and ACDA for this platform as well, and Garrett Hammond, whose idea was to have the social media takeover. He's our membership and communications and all things technology, if you will, at ACDA, and this was his vision of having a social media takeover. And so, Garrett, thank you for supporting this. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Until next time, our next hour will be featuring a new professional vocal ensemble called Exigence. Thank you.